Imagine the worst city you can think of. What is it? Look, whatever it was, I want you to do me a favor. Multiply it by at least 1,000, stretch it from horizon to horizon, toss in multiple nuclear fallouts, mutants crawling through the cracks, and a nightmare of overcrowding. And all of this ruled by a government that answers every problem with one guy shouting, "I am the law." Welcome, creeps, to Mega City 1, home of Judge Dredd. And Judge Dredd is a lot of things. One of the most simultaneously simple but complex characters ever made, and the centerpiece of one of the most influential, satirical, and straight-up weird universes ever created, with mutants, nuclear fallouts, robot wars, and even a Batman crossover. So, on the surface, this sounds like sheer chaos, but dig deeper and you'll find some of the sharpest satire of the last 50 years hiding underneath. So, in this video, we're going to dive into all of it. What Judge Dredd is really about, the decades of stories that it spawned, and the strange pile of its adaptations, including some that I promise 99.9% of you will never have even heard of. And finally, where the franchise stands today to explore whatever happened to Judge Dredd. Hello everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examines. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons who keep this channel alive. Thank you. Judge Joe Dredd. Created by writer John Wagner and artist Carlos Esquerra, or more broadly his larger universe, is probably one of the most terrifying, claustrophobic, and just plain settings ever conceived by man. Now, I know someone in the comments is furiously typing in all caps, "But Warhammer 40k!" But here's the thing. What makes Dredd hit way harder than most grimdark, which, by the way, you could very easily argue it helped influenced, is that for nearly 5 decades, yes, that's 5-0, this one hits much more uncomfortably close to home. Now sure, you've got your zombie invasions, robot uprisings, and even ape crime syndicates tearing up this mega metropolis, but underneath all of that spectacle, it's rooted in something way more terrifying and honestly way more relevant. Police brutality, severe overpopulation with next to zero employment options, the constant shadow of a police state ready to throw you in jail for the smallest possible infraction. And between that and say fish people from Lovecraftian horror, well, I know which one I'm actually more terrified of on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so before I get ahead of myself, let's break down what this universe actually is, why it's so awful to live in, and the weirdly fascinating implications of that awfulness, and where our beloved, but also deeply complicated, we'll go with that, Judge Dredd fits into the whole thing. Basically, the world of Dredd is what you'd get if you threw in every single apocalypse idea into a blender and then curb stomp that blender while screaming, "I am the law!" Now, to make a long story short, out of endless wars, nuclear strikes, environmental collapse, rampant crime, AI deregulation, and starvation, humanity crammed itself into a handful of mega cities. And by the way, when I say nuclear wars, I don't just mean one apocalypse. Oh, no. Dredd's world has had several. That's how bad things are. You can't even get by with a singular nuclear holocaust in this universe. You need multiple. And out of this delightful recipe of soup, we got the first and the most infamous of them all, Mega City 1. Now, if I had to sum up Mega City 1 in one word, that would probably be terrifying. Terrifying in scale, terrifying to live in, terrifying in its sheer claustrophobia. Now, at its peak, the city was home to nearly 800 million people. So picture a sprawling concrete nightmare stretching from New England down to Florida, packed wall to wall with skyscraping megablocks. Now, unemployment sits at something like 95%, and when hundreds of millions of bored people are crammed into one city, you get, well, job riots, crime waves, and insane cultural trends. We're talking competitive eating taking so far that it becomes a sport, or people deliberately making themselves as ugly as possible because why not? And then, just to crank up the nightmare dial, Mega City 1 has survived not one, but multiple apocalyptic events. Entire swaths of the city have been burnt out and rebuilt, and its population has been cut in half at times. Food is grown in vats, the dead are recycled, and the walls of the surrounding city are so massive that they essentially double as a fortress against mutants, raiders, and anyone else desperate enough to try to sneak in or out. Now, other megacities exist all across the world, in Russia, Europe, even on the moon, but each one is basically its own nation state, isolated and paranoid. Megacity 1 just happens to be the biggest, loudest, and arguably the most insane of them all. So, here's a question. How do you even manage that tidal wave of humanity packed into such a small, tiny place? Well, I'm glad you asked, because the answer, my friend, is to essentially streamline the law into oblivion. So, let's talk about the Justice Department. The judges in this universe don't just enforce the law, they are the law. Acting as judge, jury, and executioner, they maintain order with a mix of terrifying efficiency and totalitarian flair. Think of them essentially as walking judicial systems, who are on duty 23 hours a day because most judges just get 10 minutes of sleep in a machine that gives them a full night's rest, so the law here quite literally never sleeps. Now, that is obviously a lot of power, but the Justice Department is also so much more than that, because they are the police, the military, and the government all wrapped into one. This is essentially a police state, and they control how a citizen is born, what they eat, what they learn, and even how you die, with a citizen's body being sent to recycling unless your family has a release fee, which of course would go to the city coffers. The citizens here live in constant fear, and for good reason, with all of the insane laws, which, as you can imagine, there are a ton of them. For example, there was infamous fat law, designed to curb obesity, and also strict anti-smoking rules to combat pollution. So what happens if you break these rules? Well, you get sent straight to the ISO cubes, which are the ultimate expression of the judge's control. There are these vertical prison blocks where citizens can be confined for even the smallest of infractions. These towering, densely packed cells are claustrophobic and, as you can guess by the name, very isolating. But I do think it's important to mention that there's another side to the coin here, because the judges, to their credit, do their best to protect the city from external and internal threats. And I think they truly believe that this is the only way we can have anything resembling order in a place crammed to the brim with the sheer magnitude of humanity. And they just might have a point. The judges themselves are armed and outfitted with their signature weapon, the Lawgiver. It's this multifunctional handgun capable of firing a variety of different ammunition types, everything from standard rounds to explosives. And they also ride a Lawmaster motorcycle, which is this supremely cool, hulking, weaponized, AI-powered machine. Now, you might think to yourself, okay, well, Mega City 1 sounds kinda awful, so I'll just leave, right? Well, no. Remember that apocalyptic nuclear war? Everything outside the city is just as terrible, if not worse. In fact, it's literally called the Cursed Earth and covers most of what used to be the United States of America. Now, the Cursed Earth is a wasteland of mutated horrors, roving bands of criminals, and super contaminated lands. So you got mutants with 6 heads, exiles from the megacities. It's kind of like Fallout meets Mad Max with a dash of cyberpunk thrown in. As you can imagine, survival here is brutal, unpredictable, and often extremely deadly. Okay, so a land escape is out. Well, you might think maybe you could just escape by swimming out into the ocean. Well, clearly, my friends, you have not been paying attention, because if you think the oceans here are any less terrible, I applaud your optimism. The Black Atlantic is what it's known by, and it's the remains of the heavily polluted Atlantic Ocean. And if you can't tell by the name, exposure is almost always fatal for any normal person. So again, sorry to belabor the point, but as you can probably tell, this world is absolutely terrible. Every type of sci-fi disaster you can imagine is basically running wild here. Psychics, aliens, mutants, rogue AI, and much more terrifying things. So, who do we have to stand up for what's right and make this world even just a little bit better? Well, the answer is nobody. No one is coming to save you. This world is doomed, and the best we've got is Judge Dredd. And to call Judge Dredd a hero is not even close to the truth. Putting it mildly, he's a can of worms. So let's finally talk about the man, the myth, the legend himself. Judge Joe Dredd is basically the last person you'd ever want to pull you over, because let's be honest, there is no way you're talking your way out of that one. Dredd isn't just a character. He's pretty much a force of nature, an immovable object, a clone grown to become the ultimate extreme of law made flesh. He's pretty much faceless, unflinching, unstoppable, and he embodies the terrifying logic of the world that he inhabits. Now, Dredd only removes his helmet occasionally, and readers are never shown his full unobscured features, which was a purposeful choice symbolizing the facelessness and soullessness of justice itself. While perpetually scowling, Dredd is the epitome of the current judge system. He is this hulking veteran judge with an extraordinarily violent upbringing, pretty much as a child soldier. Over the decades, he's fought in multiple wars, led intergalactic missions after having his eyes gouged out, crawled through radioactive wastelands, and even faced off against supernatural monsters, which is all the more impressive because by this point, he is old. And speaking of that, Dredd is an extremely unique character in the fact that he ages in real time, and he's currently aged in his mid-80s, but is kept alive through futuristic medical procedures. So since his first appearance was in the 70s, every one of those real-life years has had at least one Dredd birthday, which is a really fascinating concept that you don't see that much, and if anyone else knows a character like that, I'd love to hear about. Anyway, to give you more of an idea about the type of guy Dredd is, let's take some choice quotes. Citizen: But, we're innocent, Judge. Dredd: Nobody's innocent, citizen. We're just here to determine the level of your guilt. Or, when some creep's holding a knife to your throat, who do you want to see riding up? Me or your elected representative? Think about it. Or, you break the law, you pay the price. I am that price. Okay, sorry about that terrible impersonation. Moving on. So sure, all of this might make him sound a little bit harsh, but when you realize Dredd's only been kissed a handful of times, always against his will, I might add, and that he's never actually been intimate with anyone, well, the man is basically the 80-plus-year-old virgin. Maybe that's why he throws himself so uncompromisingly into being the law. Now, one of the things that makes Dredd such a unique character is that I don't think his creators ever really meant for him to be a hero. In fact, they went out of their way just to show how awful he can actually be. He's remorseless and done some genuinely despicable things, and I'm not just talking about mowing down surrendering unarmed enemies, though yeah, he does do that on occasion, but despite all of this, people still love him. And I think it's probably because he's not cruel for cruelty's sake. His brutality is terrifying, but it's practical. It's literally lawful. He is the law. And he frames everything as being for the greater good. And every so often, there are little glimpses of humanity that do slip through. Dredd, in his own way, genuinely cares about his city and wants to protect it. Now, whether that protection is actually good for the person he just shot in the face, well, that's another question. He's often been described kind of like a glacier. Slow-moving, unstoppable, and yeah, he does have character development, but it's always at a crawl, inch by inch. In the early issues, he was almost a parody of Law and Order, completely one note in his obsession, but over time, more layers have been added. And honestly, I think the key to his complexity is actually his simplicity. Now, I know that sounds backward, but that nihilistic single-mindedness, his absolute devotion to the law, even when he knows the law itself is rotten, is what makes him so fascinating. And interestingly enough, Dredd himself often feels like a supporting character in his own comic. The real star of the show is probably the world that he moves through. Now, speaking of that, of course, Judge Dredd isn't the only weird or fascinating person or even thing in this universe. The 2000 AD world is packed with a good amount of recurring characters, although spoilers, a lot of them will die, and often with very little ceremony because, again, this world is awful. The Justice Department itself is a sprawling ecosystem. You've got different types of judges: street judges, med judges, desk judges, but within that system, some characters do stand out. So let's just name a few, although trust, there are way more out there. So first off, we got Hershey, Dredd's occasional partner. She starts off as a green, open-minded judge, hey, even capable of joking. But years on the job go really hard on her. By the time she reaches the chief judge's seat, she's no-nonsense, pragmatic, and definitely willing to make morally questionable choices to get results. We've also got Judge Anderson, who's part of the Justice Department's Psi Division, which, yeah, by the way, there are psionic abilities in here too, because I told you they just dumped everything in the setting and the kitchen sink, and I love it. On a bit of the quirkier side, we got Walter, who is Dredd's occasional robot sidekick / former servo droid. Walter calls Dredd Judge Dredd due to a mechanical speech impediment and gets treated like absolute garbage in response, even though Walt has saved Dredd's life on several occasions. So toxic relationship, I guess. So that's all well and good, but what's the actual plot here? Well, at its heart, Judge Dredd is about, Dredd laying down the law. But it's also so much more than that. The world that he inhabits ensures that his law is constantly being tested by nearly every imaginable apocalypse, crisis, or just plain insane scenario you can think of. Now, sure, the stories start relatively simple: Dredd battling criminals atop the Empire State Building, cracking heads, enforcing order. But over the years, the series explodes into some truly wild, world-defining arcs that elevate it far beyond cop comics. So here's a quick tour of the highlights. We got Robot Wars, which is Dredd's first long-form storyline and has him heroically leading the fight to put down a revolt by the city's droid workforce, corrupted by a crazed robot messiah. Then we got Blockmania / the Apocalypse War, which is one of the earliest examples of the series going absolutely apocalyptic. What starts as a gang war between rival blocks, which is a whole thing unto itself, because in Megacity, every block is basically its own violent microstate, quickly escalates into a nuclear attack by the hostile Soviet forces of East Meg 1. Cities are flattened, and this is one of the earliest examples that really just upped the scope and scale to cataclysmic proportions. Probably one of the most interesting arcs on a lot of levels is America, which zooms out and shows the day-to-day human cost of Dredd's world. In this one, we see judges from the perspective of ordinary citizens and how this protection often ruins people's lives. And taking it a step further, the story really drives home how impossible it is for democracy or even basic freedom to coexist with the judge system. It's grim, ironic, and probably one of the examples where the creators really showed their hand and tried to underscore that Dredd is not a good dude. Now, of course, we have got to talk about the dark judges, otherwise I'm sure some of you would wait for it. Judge me. Huh? And to be fair, these are iconic. The crime is life. The sentence is death. Now, because he cannot be killed, Judge Death is probably the most reoccurring villain of the Judge Dredd stories, and all the other dark judges have these really iconic designs. Judge Fear, Judge Fire, Judge Mortis, and of course, Judge Death himself. Mortis's sheepskull head alone is absolute nightmare fuel, and the dark judges reflect the terrifying potential of the Justice Department taking to its darkest extreme. There are some great iconic lines in here, terrifying imagery, and also probably some of the greatest panels in the history of the series in here. Now, all of this is literally just scratching the surface. There are so many other classics I could name off here. Origins, The Pit, Necropolis, and of course that one time Dredd squared off versus an army of real-world fast food mascots. And speaking of crossover madness, we also got Judge Dredd versus aliens, predators, and even several with Batman. Basically, with a series this long running, as you can imagine, there is at least some type of form of chaos in here for everyone. And on top of this, the world building and aesthetic of Judge Dredd is just thick. I'm not even talking about the arts, which is incredible, of course, but to put on my pretentious glasses, it has this je ne sais quoi. There's not just one thing I could point to, it's the totality of all the small parts. The crowded, relentless panels of Mega City 1, the hopelessly prescient laws of the judges, the borderline nihilistic storylines, and just the entire aesthetic. It's visceral, and even today, it's still unique. I've just never seen anything else quite like it. I don't even think I could describe it. It's not steampunk, it's not cyberpunk, it's kind of like dark futurism. And of course, the art is gorgeous, stunning, and extremely experimental. The medium of the panels does so much work to show the sheer scale of everything going on, and this is reflected in every aspect, from the city itself, the judges' equipment and outfits, and of course the endless sprawl of Mega City 1. Even the way people talk here just has its own flavor, from Dredd calling all the bad guys creeps, or all the judges yelling by Grud instead of God. On top of that, there's this bizarre mix of hopelessness and satirical nihilism. This is wild world building that's insane, terrifying, but also fun. Space and lunar stuff exists. There's a weird robot sidekick, gangster apes, ninjas, and even a sexual fanfic of Judge Dredd in universe. The city has had an actual orangutan in political office and was actually one of the most popular ones until, of course, he was assassinated, because this is 2000 AD and everything sucks here. And that's not even it, because another thing that makes Judge Dredd so interesting is because it's one of those series that's been picked apart to death for its themes, messages, and politics. Which is kind of funny, because on surface value, it looks simple, right? Big, ugly cop stomps out the baddie, and some really cathartic one-liners, like when Judge Dredd literally punches out one of the dark judges with the line, "Gaze into the fist of Dredd." Or another one of my favorites, standing over a launch console and snarling, "Half my city is burnt to ash by East Meg missiles, and you're begging me for mercy? Request denied." Before dispassionately launching a retaliatory nuclear strike that annihilates a city of 500 million ordinary people. Now, that all being said, the second you dig even an inch beneath that surface, things get messy in a good way. Because this isn't just a power fantasy. A lot of people straight up read it as a political cartoon and a satire of far-right America, or even a reaction of Thatcherism in the UK. In fact, the symbols are there from day one. Dredd is in this eagle-covered regalia, and later comics would even drop the metaphor entirely. Like when a fellow judge flat out tells Dredd to his face that, hey, we're fascists. And the best thing is that the comics go further and start asking the hard questions that don't have easy answers. What is justice? What is the price of justice? Is freedom worth that price? Can you uphold law and order without destroying the very people you're meant to protect? And it's just no wonder that there have been books and essays delving into all of the different meanings here. So how did something this dystopian, this bleak, and this utterly unique even come about? Well, the story is actually extremely chaotic and messy, and honestly, it's kind of a miracle it ever even happened at all. Now, quick warning, part of the reason why it's so messy is that you can't just point to one guy or one moment, presumably looking out at a 1970s New York graffiti-covered landscape and suddenly just inventing Judge Dredd on the spot. Oh, no. He is more of a byproduct of many different circumstances, visions, and people colliding over the years. And just to give you the sense of scale here, there's over 2,000 individual issues, or progs as they're called in-house, since the original was all the way back in 1977. So fair warning, I'm going to throw a good amount of names at you, so try to keep up, creeps. Back in 1976, writer Pat Mills was putting together 2000 AD. He wanted something loud, violent, and unlike anything else out there, so he recruited his old writing partner, John Wagner, who had already written a Dirty Harry-inspired strip called One-Eyed Jack. And in case it's not already obvious, that Dirty Harry vibe was a huge influence on Judge Dredd. Now, in the context of the era, we've got to remember that crime was a big deal. Today, it might be hard to picture if you're walking through Brooklyn with a $12 cup of coffee, but in the 1970s, crime was at epidemic levels in the US, and parts of New York City weren't that far removed from dystopia. Movies like The Warriors and Dirty Harry reflected that, and in turn, Judge Dredd would take it to its logical conclusion. Mills, who had cut his teeth on anti-authoritarian books and also very violent books like Battle, knew that readers responded to rebel characters, sure, but they also ate up authority figures. So, he thought, what happens if you give them the ultimate authority figure and strip them of any nuance? For the visuals, Carlos Ezquerra was tapped and came back with designs that were way more extreme than anyone had pictured. Towering megacities, fascist-looking armor, a grimacing jaw hidden under that now iconic helmet. Now, originally Dredd was supposed to be near future, but this vision was way more sci-fi than they had imagined, and they just decided to roll with it. As far as the name itself, it's actually pretty incredible. Mills had planned a horror strip for 2000 AD featuring an occult detective named Judge Dredd, but they changed the name to avoid any confusion with the bawdy UK reggae singer of the same name, which apparently he got inspired by. Now, this is hilarious because this now grimdark futuristic cop shares his name, well, with an extra D, with a guy who sang reggae full of sex jokes. Seriously, if you get a chance, check out some of his banger tracks. He's basically just this white ska reggae artist from the UK. You won't regret it, and I wish I could show you some of the lyrics on screen, but YouTube would probably send me to an ISO cube. Anyway, going back to the timeline, of course, getting this off the ground wasn't easy. The parent company IPC wasn't exactly confident in the extreme boundary pushing of 2000 AD, and it was an uphill battle alone with the censors. On top of that, development was really chaotic from the start. Both Wagner and Ezquerra actually quit the strip at different points over issues of pay and characters' rights, but both would eventually return. Now, that revolving door energy defined the early 2000 AD, but despite all of that chaos, Dredd struck. And by issue 9, Wagner was back with the Robot Wars, and that was really when Dredd became the star of 2000 AD. From then on, he's appeared in almost every weekly issue, over 2,000 and counting, and plenty of different creators have come and gone, but Wagner has remained at the heart of the series, shaping Dredd for decades. And it does have to be said that Wagner probably is one of the defining forces over the years. He gave us stories like The Day the Law Died, Necropolis, and without Wagner, Dredd's popularity likely wouldn't have endured. So here's the thing about Judge Dredd. The guy has been running non-stop for over 48 years across thousands of weekly issues, plus spin-offs, specials, and reboots. So the question is, how do you actually read this without losing your mind? Well, the good news is that you don't need to start at page 1 and grind through every single prog, short for program, which means single issue of the weekly comic. But there are a few smart ways to do it, which you'll see people recommend. Option 1 are the case files. These are the big black spined complete case file collections, and they reprint Dredd's story in chronological order. If you're a completionist, this is a straight shot from day 1 in the late 70s all the way through the modern era. Now, there are over 40 volumes and counting, so yeah, that's a lot of stuff, but also a lot of good stuff. Now, some fans will tell you to skip ahead to Case Files Volume 5 because that's where the series really finds its voice and includes the absolutely iconic Apocalypse War. That said, some of the early strips are very dated and the tone took a little while to establish itself. They're definitely worth a look, but they aren't really indicative of the more modern Dredd, and even Dredd himself looks wildly different, way more lean and toned down. Now, if reading through all of the issues like that sounds a little bit intimidating, you do have another option, which are the essentials. If you just want the classic best stories, these are the curated greatest hits collections. So things like America, Origins, or the Apocalypse War, presented in nice big editions and color. Think of these kind of as a sampler platter. You get the best stories without committing to reading every single prog along the way. Now, outside of those, you also got stuff like the editions from IDW, who actually did a total restart. These are kind of alternate takes. Some of them are decent and some of them maybe less so. Speaking of spin-offs and other versions, there's actually a ton of other interesting stuff in here. The Judge Dredd magazine, which started in 1990 as a standalone spin-off title, is basically stories that take place across the extended Dreddverse, including further tales of the man himself plus other judges, both from Mega City 1 and other judge systems around the world, and many of these eventually got reprinted in the case files. The restricted files are another oddball collection. These were the stories that ran in annuals or special summer/winter issues. Like the magazine, they mostly run alongside the main series, but their standalone nature makes them less essential. Now, in the mid-90s, DC actually got into the action too and produced their own series. However, these stories are set in an entirely different universe, so this was probably just an excuse for them to do a crossover Batman/Judge Dredd, which I guess was bound to happen at some point. We also got Heavy Metal Dredd, which was a series of ultra-violent one-off Dredd stories set in a completely separate, more aggressive universe. Then Lawmen of the Future in 1995 is the polar opposite of Heavy Metal. This one was aimed at younger readers and a licensed spin-off from the 95 Stallone movie. Finally, also in 1995, I would be remiss not to mention, well, the Japanese version. Japan got its own unique take on Dredd, which is wild, right? And hilariously, apparently these are super rare. So if you have one, congratulations, you are probably sitting on some cash. Now, when you think about Judge Dredd adaptations, odds are your brain jumps straight to Stallone in comically huge boots, or maybe Carl Urban scowling under the helmet while tossing a crime boss off a balcony. Now, I'm willing to bet that most Americans at least know Judge Dredd specifically because of the movies. And yes, it's true the movies have been a big part of the Dredd zeitgeist, but here's the twist. The biggest and earliest body of adaptations hasn't been on the big screen, it's actually been the books. And there are a lot of them, like way too many for me to cover in one sitting. Full-length novels, ebooks, we're talking the Mega City works here. Even tracking the exact number is kind of tricky because they've been published across different companies, different decades, and it also kind of depends how you even count them. But the major pushes have been in a few distinct eras. In the early 90s, Virgin Books published a number of different titles like the Savage Amusement and Wetworks, and even had plans for a Doctor Who Judge Dredd tie-in, which unfortunately never materialized. Then in the early 2000s, Black Flame picked up the baton, putting out a run of Dredd novels, and from 2011 onward, Rebellion took over and leaned into some really interesting ideas, launching lines like Judge Dredd Year 1 and later Year 2 and 3, exploring Dredd's earliest cases. And these are really great books in their own rights, and if you were going to start at any of them, I'd probably recommend these. It also doesn't stop there. There's been a trilogy about the Dark Judges, a whole Judge series about the very first generation of law officers, and even stories about Dredd's clone brother Rico. Basically, if there's a corner of Mega City 1 that hasn't been filled in by the comics, odds are someone's written a novel about it. Now, if you're more of an audio person, a lot of these books, plus adaptations of the classic case files, are available as audiobooks, including on Spotify. And as a fun aside, there was actually an audiobook version of some of the essential Judge Dredd, which, by the way, are really well done. But one of them is narrated by Doug Cockle, aka Geralt of Rivia from The Witcher. So it's just kind of fun and a bit existential to hear Geralt growl, "You've been sentenced to 20 years in the ISO cubes." Okay, so all of that aside, let's talk about the big adaptations that most people know for both the very good and the very bad reasons, the movies. When most people think Judge Dredd movie, odds are the first image that will come to mind is Stallone in platform boots yelling, "I am the law." And right there is why this film is so divisive. By all accounts, Stallone overshadowed everything. I mean, it's right there on the poster. His name literally comes before the title. And his decision to take the helmet off and show his face, which, by the way, is something Dredd never does in the comics, was sacrilegious to longtime fans. But hey, if you're paying Stallone money, you're going to want to see Stallone's face. Now, the film was directed by Danny Cannon, who seemed to genuinely love 2000 AD. In fact, he even designed a Dredd movie poster as a kid for a contest. But Cannon's darker satirical version clashed with Stallone, who thought he'd signed up for an action comedy. By Stallone's own admission later, the final cut was cut down from an NC-17 rating to a PG-13 and barely resembled the script. Now, this constant tug of war was so bad that Cannon actually swore off working with a big-name star ever again. And Stallone himself later called the entire thing a huge missed opportunity. The behind-the-scenes documentary is literally titled Stallone's Law, which that alone should tell you everything. So the question is, was it any good? And honestly, there are flashes of brilliance. The Blocks War opener is straight out of the 80s strip. Mega City 1's design and the first few shots of it are incredible and took over a year to actually build. The Lawmasters look stunning, and the costumes, even the insane boots, were spot on. And the FX crew were using real effects. So the scene with Stallone running through a fireball hallway, well, that fire was real. And it's clear a lot of very smart, passionate people put their hearts into this production. Unfortunately, the second half of the movie veers into generic buddy cop territory, with Rob Schneider as comic relief and way too many plot lines jammed into one movie. The tone is all over the place, half grim satire, half summer popcorn flick, and it never really quite lands. Critics, fans, and even the creators of the comic panned it, and the film underperformed at the box office. Still, I'll admit there are a lot of aspects that hold up, and it's kind of a bad fun type of movie. And honestly, it gets at least an A in my books because I can't, in my heart of hearts, hate anything with a 90s Joan Chin in it. Now, if you walked out of Judge Dredd in 95 disappointed, redemption was on the horizon. It would just take a little while to get there. Because 17 years later, we finally got the Dredd movie fans had been waiting for. No helmet removal, no comedy sidekick, just Karl Urban's gravelly monotone, a much tighter story, and a brutal stripped-down Mega City 1. Instead of neo-futurism, this city felt like a crime-ridden sprawl of today, just turned up to 11. Wagner himself signed off on the script, praising it as the first true Dredd on screen, and in a very cathartic moment, his name actually appears in the credit. Now, the shooting itself feels so visceral and it's so bloody. The slow-mo sequences are gorgeous, hyper-stylized bursts of color in an otherwise grim palette. And fun detail, the Lawmaster bikes were fully functional, and Urban himself insisted that he would ride it himself. I also saw somewhere that apparently he stayed in character so much that people claim he never smiled once on set. Fans and critics loved it. The problem though, nobody really wanted to see it. Despite a modest budget, Dredd failed to break even at the box office. It's one of those cruel ironies that the faithful adaptation bombed, while the messy 95 film at least made some cultural noise. And the tragedy doesn't even stop there, because actually there was an entire trilogy mapped out around this. Film 2 would have delved into Dredd's origins, and Film 3 would have brought in Judge Death and the Dark Judges, which I would have done anything to see. But because the film never broke even, none of these could be justified. Now, fans did rally hard. They got petitions with nearly 100,000 signatures, massive online campaigns, but to make a long, painful story short, nothing ever came of it. Now, speaking of heartbreaking what could have beens, we've also got to talk about the Judge Dredd TV series. Believe it or not, this goes all the way back to 95. Right after the Stallone movie, reports surfaced that an animated Judge Dredd show was in development, possibly for a 96-97 release. Now, details out there are super scarce. Apparently no studio was ever attached, no art or scripts ever surfaced, but the idea of a mid-90s Judge Dredd cartoon really just gets your imagination going wild. And my mind immediately goes to a Dredd anime, which would look so awesome, right? Anyway, fast forward a couple decades and the dream was alive again. In 2017, Rebellion, who currently owns 2000 AD, announced a live-action series called Judge Dredd Mega City 1. The The pitch was basically an ensemble drama, less about Dredd himself, although he would make appearances, more about a squad of rookie judges dealing with the insanity of Mega City 1. Think Law and Order if Law and Order had mutants, block wars, and cannibal gangs, which again sounds amazing. But then silence. The pandemic hit just as production began, and officially it's still in development, but at this point it feels like one of those shows that is permanently stuck on the cursed project list. Now, if the TV and film side of things leaves you a little depressed, don't worry, because there is one medium where Judge Dredd has shown up a lot: video games. Now, this can get a bit confusing because they are literally all called the same thing, Judge Dredd, but let's walk through these step by step. Judge Dredd in 1986 was the very first Dredd game, and on paper, it sounded really ambitious for the time. You roam around Mega City 1, trying to keep crime levels down, deciding whether to resolve cases violently or non-violently, and you even get to ride the Lawmaster. Then you got 1990 Judge Dredd. This was a side-scrolling platformer shooter, and again you were tasked with lowering crime rates across the city. It's definitely a step up from the 1986 game with more varied levels, better visuals, and a bit better gameplay. Then, in 1995, we got another, you guessed it, Judge Dredd. This was released to tie in with the Stallone movie, and probably what most people think of when they think of 90s Dredd games, if you think of anything at all, I don't know. Actually though, it's pretty solid. A run and gun action platformer in the same DNA as Contra or Duke Nukem, with lots of shooting options via the Lawgiver, multiple levels, and even some hover bike sequences. And then we got Judge Dredd: Dredd vs. Death in 2003. Now, this was a first-person shooter for PS2, Xbox, GameCube, etc., and you play as, well, Dredd himself, blasting your way through cultists, vampires, and the Dark Judges in a campaign that's short but sweet. It's very early 2000s FPS vibes, but fans love it for the Easter eggs and comic references, and even today people call it the closest we've gotten to feeling like Dredd in a game. Okay, and technically Horror City isn't a Dredd game, but originally it was pitched as a Judge Anderson spin-off in Mega City 1. You'd use the Lawgiver in first person, fighting gangs in a dystopian city, and the concept was later reworked into a different universe, but it's still basically the same DNA, just a different name. Now, it's a real shame that there hasn't been a modern Dredd game. Honestly, I'd even take a cyberpunk mod where you can arrest people and ride around on the Lawgiver. Now, interestingly, Rebellion has floated the idea of letting other developers work with 2080 properties, but so far nothing has come of it, which is doubly frustrating because Rebellion themselves makes pretty solid games. Just look at Sniper Elite or the recently released Atomfall. Now, if you thought Dredd was only kicking around in comics, games, and movies, well, buckle up because we are just getting started, and board games was a whole other thing. A few standouts over the years have been Judge Dredd, the game of crime fighting in Mega City 1 in 1982 by none other than Games Workshop. That's right, the Warhammer people. Looking back, it makes sense. It was a British company going after a British comic that they clearly loved. The game itself is for 2 to 6 players, each taking the role of a judge patrolling Mega City 1. The best part is the presentation. The board and the cards were drawn by actual 2080 artists. A revised version of the game that remains true to the original was actually released in 2023 and is currently available. Now, GW came back a few years later with Block Mania in 1987, and this one is just pure chaos. 2 players each control a city block and try to trash the other one before the judges show up to stop it. You're setting fires, collapsing walls, unleashing riots. It's messy, fast-paced, and very 80s game design. And again, they just nailed the presentation, and it even got later expansions. In 2019, we got the Cursed Earth. This one is more of a modern card-driven game with co-op, competitive, and solo modes. And the setup is you're basically leading a team of judges across the wasteland outside of Mega City 1, dealing with mutants, hostile terrain, and the occasional classic Dredd character popping up. Now, those are just the board games, which is only half of the coin because Dredd has also inspired an incredible amount of tabletop games, from role-playing to miniatures. In fact, this might be one of the most fully realized tabletop settings of any property I've ever covered, which is saying something. The first official RPG release came from, can you guess it, Games Workshop in 1985. Now, again, Again, the rulebook was packed with gorgeous illustrations straight from the comics and a ton of detailed world building. The equipment options range from the standard lawgiver pistol to psychic abilities, and it all felt really fleshed out. And over the years, several supplements expanded the game, including adventures like Slaughter Margin and City Block, where you could even design your own city blocks, which is a really cool touch. Now, over the years, there's actually been way more, including ones from Mongoose Publishing, one from E-In Publishing called Judge Dredd and the Worlds of 2000 AD, and even a more modern Jenga-based Judge Dredd RPG in 2022, which, yeah, that Jenga, which is a weird place for this. Now, although a ton of these look like a blast, just full transparency, I was not able to get a hold of many of them, or even see some of these rulebooks, so I can't really speak on them. I'd be curious to know if anyone has played these and what your thoughts are, and which one you think is the best. But truly an unhinged amount of TTRPGs, which you don't see that often in a lot of other franchises, so that's really great because Mega City 1 is a really amazing setting. As far as adaptations, we are not even done, if you can believe that, because Dredd has basically invaded every medium imaginable. So just for the sake of my sanity and this video's brevity, to speed things along, let's just rapid fire some of the other wild versions of Dredd that have popped up over the years. These include Judge Dredd Pinball, Judge Dredd Light Gun Shooter, Judge Dredd Arcade Games, Judge Dredd Collectible Card Games, Judge Dredd Soundtracks, and of course, multiple Judge Dredd mobile games. Look, it's one of those things that have spun off into eternity and beyond, and I'm probably missing a good amount out there. So please, if there's anything I didn't mention, please let me know about them in the comments and I'll throw it in the description. So what's been happening with Judge Dredd lately, and where is our dearly loved, slightly fascist judge now? Well, Rebellion still owns 2000 AD, and funny enough, as another weird aside, the same guy who owns Rebellion also runs the Modern History TV YouTube channel, which, okay. But anyway, they genuinely do seem to want to make moves with the brands, but making those things has proved tricky. On the adaptation side, things are a little murky. Aside from the long-discussed Mega City 1 TV project, which we haven't heard anything about in a while, there were rumors that Urban might return as Dredd for an Amazon Prime series. That did turn out to be false though, so don't get your hopes up yet. More promising, in 2025, it was reported that a new film adaptation of Judge Dredd is in development, and Taika Waititi is attached to direct. Now, I've seen a lot of people say a lot of things about this project so far, saying that it's going to be a disaster, but personally, I think that's a bit of a ridiculous speculation, considering there's quite literally next to no information about this out yet. So for example, there's no studio attached yet, and it's still being shopped around Hollywood, so it's really TBD right now, and too early to make any calls about this one way or the other. Speaking of which, it's very possible this could just never get off the ground at all. So overall, the adaptation picture isn't exactly bright, but on the comic side, things are much healthier. Despite coming close to cancellation over the years, Judge Dredd is still ongoing. In fact, one of the most recent progs came out just a few days ago, making Dredd one of the most longest running comic series out there. Now, even if the adaptations are a bit messy, the Judge Dredd fandom is thriving and incredibly dedicated. First up, the fan resources. The official 2000 AD website is amazing. It has a ton of amazing content and a great podcast called Thrillcast, which features a bunch of interviews from the creators. Speaking of podcasts, there are some really great fan ones too. Cyberpunk Cinema has an excellent episode diving into Dredd, Nerd of Mouth has some fun coverage as well, and there's also Everything Comes Back to 2000 AD, Prog Slog, Space Center 200, and the Mega City Book Club show. As far as websites, aside from the excellent wiki, we also have Barney, which is named after Mega City 1's City Hall computer. It's a fan-created and maintained site and a veritable wealth of logistical data and an invaluable resource for all things 2000 AD. Of course, fan art is absolutely insane. People have been creating incredible professional quality pieces for decades, and some fans are downright ambitious. One example is the fan film Judge Minty, which I honestly can't even imagine how much work went into something like that, which is ridiculous in the best way possible. On top of that, you best believe cosplay is a thing here too, with people sharing their outfits in a surprisingly wholesomely, is that a word? Reddit community, multiple Discord servers, and plenty of Facebook pages, which chief among them is probably the 77 2000 AD group, which is Facebook's first and biggest 2000 AD group. And it's honestly hard to just overstate how influential Judge Dredd has been over the years. From Anthrax songs to RoboCop owing more than a little to Dredd, and I'm pretty convinced Cyberpunk 2077's aesthetic is drenched in Dredd DNA. And in fact, for all you 40K fans out there, Games Workshop has pointed to Dredd as a direct influence to Warhammer. So the question is, why? Why does a comic about a roided up cop stomping villains in a nightmare city been so influential over the years and is still resonating 5 decades later? Well, I think part of it is that Mega City 1 is timeless in its awfulness. It takes real world fears, overpopulation, corruption, inequality, and cranks it up to 11. On the surface, it's blunt, just one man, one law, one giant gun. But scratch under that armor and you get a messy tangle of moral questions. And that accessibility mixed with that depth makes it really engaging to a wide degree of different audiences. And finally, there's the sheer look of it all. The sprawling megacities, the over-the-top judges, the grotesque mutants. It's such a visually striking world, and even if you've never cracked open a 2000 AD issue, you've probably felt its impact. So, in conclusion, no matter which block you creeps call home, in order to stay out of those ISO cubes, make sure you follow the laws of Mega City 1, because Grud helps you if you get pulled over by Judge Dredd. I want to give an enormous shout out to the fandom's most wanted for the crime of excessive judge spotting, the creep they call Mac Anorak. They are a wealth of Judge Dredd knowledge, and I couldn't have done this without them. I also want to give a shout out to the Judge Dredd Reddit as well for the people on there who helped me fact check. As always, no shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons who keep this channel alive and running. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. You guys are the judges to my Mega City 1 in a slightly less terrifying way. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out my Patreon link in the description below, where you can get access to cool things like the channel's Discord and Patreon exclusive content. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment below and I promise I'll check it out. Anyway, thanks so much again. I hope you have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye.